Young and the Restless spoilers shock next week, full September 30th to October 4th. The night had settled quietly over Genoa City, but Daniel's mind was anything but calm. After receiving a cryptic message from Heather earlier that evening, his heart had been racing with anxiety. The message was brief, uncharacteristic of Heather. "Don't worry, I'm fine, I'll be back later." There were no details, no explanation, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Lucy had grown increasingly worried, and Daniel, sensing her unease, had gently coaxed her to bed, reassuring her that her mother was probably out with friends. "She's probably just catching up with old friends, Lucy. You know how she is." Daniel had smiled, but even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were hollow. His own concern was gnawing at him, and once Lucy had finally fallen asleep, Daniel grabbed his keys and jacket, determined to track Heather down. Something felt off, and Daniel's instincts were never wrong. Heather was missing. He just didn't know why. He drove around the city, visiting the places she often frequented, their favorite cafe, the park, and even a few of her closest friends' houses. But everywhere he went, the answer was the same. No one had seen Heather. As the hours ticked by and his calls went unanswered, Daniel's fear turned into something much darker. Panic. Had she been kidnapped? It seemed absurd, but the way Heather had vanished so suddenly without a trace felt wrong. Back at the house, Phyllis was preoccupied with a plan of her own, one that involved pulling together a powerful alliance against Victor Newman. She and Billy had been working together for weeks, trying to uncover the one weakness that could bring Victor to his knees. But so far their efforts had been fruitless. Victor was a fortress, impenetrable, calculating, and always 3 steps ahead. Phyllis, however, was nothing if not resourceful. She had an idea brewing, and it involved her daughter, Summer. Summer and Kyle were still entangled in a complicated relationship, and Phyllis knew that Kyle's hatred for Victor had been festering ever since his business dealings had taken a dark turn. Victor had manipulated, pushed, and used Kyle to his advantage, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Phyllis could sense it, Kyle's resentment, and she intended to use it to her benefit. "Billy, I think it's time we bring Kyle into the fold," Phyllis suggested one evening, her mind racing with the possibilities. "He hates Victor just as much as we do, and Summer can help sway him to our side." Billy was skeptical, but intrigued. "You think Kyle's going to turn against Victor? He's got a lot on the line." Phyllis smirked, her eyes gleaming with determination. "Kyle's smart, but he's also fueled by emotion. He feels betrayed by Victor. If we can play on that, if Summer can get through to him, Kyle might just..." Billy nodded slowly, seeing the logic in Phyllis's plan. Kyle was fiercely loyal to the people he loved, and if he believed Victor was a threat to him or Summer, it was entirely possible that he would join their cause. And with Kyle on their side, they could strike at Victor where it hurt the most. From within. Meanwhile, back at the Newman household, Faith had been growing more and more suspicious of her mother, Sharon. For days now, Sharon had been acting strange. Distant, jittery, as if something were haunting her every move. And then tonight, when Sharon had finally returned home after being gone for hours, Faith's heart had sunk. There was something unmistakably wrong. Sharon's clothes were disheveled, her face pale, and most alarmingly, there were faint streaks of blood on her shirt. Faith's breath caught in her throat as she watched her mother stumble through the door, her eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. "Mom?" Faith's voice was hesitant, filled with the kind of worry that only a child who knows something terrible has happened can express. "Are you okay?" Sharon had looked at her, her eyes wild, as if she wasn't entirely present. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a rough day." But the way she said it, the way her hands trembled as she pulled off her jacket, it told a different story. Faith's stomach twisted with dread. She knew something was horribly wrong, but she didn't know what. Faith didn't push further, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something dark was looming just beneath the surface. She decided to keep a closer eye on her mother, to figure out what was really going on, but every instinct in her body was screaming that Sharon had done something awful. The blood, the fear in her mother's eyes, it all pointed to a terrible truth that Faith wasn't ready to face. As the days passed, Daniel's search for Heather grew more frantic. He called her friends, revisited places they frequented, But it was as if Heather had disappeared into thin air. His anger and frustration boiled over. Where was she? Why wasn't anyone helping him find her? Phyllis, too, noticed Daniel's distress and quietly began to worry that something more sinister was at play. But she couldn't be distracted now, not with her plan in motion. Summer was already working to pull Kyle into their circle, and if everything went according to plan, they could finally dismantle Victor's empire. But as the pieces moved into place, the secrets simmering beneath the surface of Genoa City threatened to erupt. Faith's suspicions of Sharon, Daniel's frantic search for Heather, and Phyllis's calculated manipulation of Kyle, all of it was teetering on the edge of disaster. Sharon's return with bloodstains on her clothes was the first crack in the facade. Faith had always trusted her mother, but now she wasn't so sure. What was Sharon hiding? And what had happened? In the end, the tangled web of lies, betrayal, and deceit would pull them all in. For Daniel, the search for Heather was about to take a dark and unexpected turn. For Faith, the discovery of her mother's secret would shatter everything she believed. And for Phyllis, her plan to take down Victor could unravel in ways she never expected. Genoa City was on the brink of chaos, and no one was safe from the storm that was about to descend. But Sharon wasn't just a suspect in Daniel's mind. She was the prime suspect. The police had yet to confirm anything, but Daniel was convinced. He had seen the way Sharon had acted in the days leading up to Heather's disappearance. The way she avoided eye contact, the strange excuses, the way she seemed nervous every time someone mentioned Heather's name. It all added up. As the funeral came to an end, Daniel's mind was already made up. He was going to confront Sharon. If she had anything to do with Heather's death, she wasn't going to get away with it. He would make sure of that. The days after the funeral were filled with unbearable grief and tension. Lucy, unable to cope with the loss, became more withdrawn. She barely spoke, barely ate, and seemed to exist in a world of her own. Phyllis tried her best to comfort her granddaughter, but even she was struggling with her own sorrow. Meanwhile, the police investigation continued. The DNA evidence they had found on Heather's body was being processed, and soon they would know who it belonged to. But for Daniel, the wait was torture. He couldn't stand the thought of Heather's killer walking free for one more day. Late one evening, Daniel found himself standing outside Sharon's house. The anger boiling inside him was almost uncontrollable. He wanted answers, and he wanted them now. Sharon opened the door, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and her eyes were filled with guilt. "Daniel," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you doing here?" "I know what you did," Daniel said, his voice low and dangerous. "I know you had something to do with Heather's death. Don't even try to deny it." Sharon's face went white. What are you talking about? I didn't." "Save it," Daniel interrupted, stepping closer. "I know you've been hiding something. I've seen the way you've been acting. Just tell me the truth." Sharon's eyes darted nervously, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might confess. But instead, she stepped back, shaking her head. "You don't know what you're talking about, Daniel. I had nothing to do with Heather's death." But Daniel didn't believe her. Not for a second. He was going to find out the truth, one way or another. The days stretched into weeks, and the investigation continued. The DNA evidence was coming together, and soon the police would have the answers they needed. But for Daniel, the only thing that mattered was finding justice for Heather. He had lost the love of his life, and now